Okay, now we're set to go. Erev Tov, everybody. Monday night as we begin Chumash Vayikra, and we begin a new commentary. Rabbi David Foreman, whose commentaries I've been aware of for the last number of years and never really had a chance to delve into. You may be familiar with his Torah website, Aleph Beta. And I recognize his name from going back to his Baltimore days when my parents learned with him at Baltimore Hebrew. Um, and then he made his way to New York. And in his acknowledgments, he thanks my father-in-law because he is on the Torah teaching team at the Young Israel of Woodmere, where there's a particular one of the many Shabbat morning tefillot there that he frequents and teaches a regular class at. And a lot of the ideas were tried out in that group first. And so we have various connections to him. Um, One of the things that I find most interesting about his commentary, and we'll see it straight away, I think, is the kind of register, before we even get to the content, the kind of register in which he writes. It's neither overly formal nor overly casual, but sometimes feels like an interesting mixture of the two. I think in an attempt to be colloquial in a way that appeals to people, but also be, I don't know if the right word is reverential or appropriate tone-wise to the depth and power of the Torah that he's commenting on. It's a kind of an interesting hybrid, I find, a slightly different way of talking about Torah and in Torah than almost any other um, writer that I've seen. And if you listen to Aleph Beta, I think it's often his voice that is speaking. They usually have kind of cartoon interfaces for a lot of the videos, but it's his voice in the background. You can sort of hear the cadences of his voice I can hear the cadences of his voice in the writing here as well. We sent last week and this week the intro, and we're not going to go through that all, but just suffice it to say that he describes his approach fundamentally as an approach of intertextuality, of understanding that when you're reading a story, you want to listen to the voice inside you that says, "Where have I heard this before?" And when individual words or phrases pop out and enough of them point to the same story from before, then you understand that there's a connection. And that connection is telling you that you can read the past story in light of the passage you're looking at now, and the passage you're looking at now in light of the past story. So they shed light on each other, their lenses for viewing each other. That's his overall approach. We see similar kinds of approaches through the idea of the mila mancha, the kind of key word, or a series of words or themes that appear in a lot of our contemporary teachers, from the Rav Menachem Leibtag, which is really a refraction in a sense of Rav Yoel bin Nun and others who came before him, Rav Elchanan Samet, to the approach that we see in Judy Klitzner and Rav Shmuel Klitzner and Judy Klitzner's subversive sequels. So this is a tried and true method, and of course, as he points out, it's not new to modern commentaries, but it's very much what the midrashic enterprise is explicitly or implicitly doing. Sometimes with Rav Meidan, we saw him kind of try to uncover the textual connections that were beneath midrashim, where the textual connection was implicit and not explicit. And Rav Meidan certainly employs this kind of approach as well. That said, uh, that resonates, of course, for narrative passages of the Tanakh, where we see certain keywords or themes in a story. But the kind of powerful contention that Rabbi Foreman is going to contend here is that this applies to the book of Vayikra as well. So I'm just going to share from the end of his introduction to Vayikra, where he says, "Those of you who aren't masters of the Midrash, but who have picked up the Genesis or Exodus volumes in this series, because we're now going to be looking at book 3 in his series of weekly Parsha companion books, the one on Vayikra. But if you've picked up Genesis or Exodus, you already have a sense of the ubiquity of intertextual patterns in biblical texts. But in this volume, more of this kind of reading is to be found. In Leviticus and Vayikra, I've leaned on this mode of analysis to try to grapple with, at least implicitly, the two issues I raised at the start of this introduction. One, the casual reader finds Leviticus barely relevant to the modern reader, meaning what does it speak to us? It's a book about the cultic practices of the tabernacle, about sacrifices and laws of purity and impurity. Two, the casual reader finds Leviticus to be an outlier in the Bible, a book seemingly disconnected from the storyline of Genesis or Exodus. So, not only do we say, what does it have to do with us, but how did we get here from the storylines that took us through the first two books? My feeling is that a key to grappling with the first of these issues lies in successfully confronting the second. We can make meaning of it for ourselves as modern readers if we can understand the continuity between Genesis and Exodus on the one hand and Leviticus on the other. So let me say, for starters, if there is one thing that I hope the volume you now hold in your hands shows you, this is a good time to dig into the introductions. This is his key point. It is that Leviticus is deeply connected to the books that precede it. The reader who reads Leviticus and plays the deceptively simple, "Where have I heard these words before?" game will find that Leviticus comprises a veritable treasure trove of intertextual connections. In law after law, passage after passage, Leviticus is picking up on threads in Genesis and Exodus and weaving these threads into rich tapestries of meaning. Indeed, contrary to first appearances, Leviticus is emphatically not a book that stands alone. It is part and parcel of an organic whole that we call the Torah. Its laws are inseparable from the stories that precede it. And once you begin to see how that is true, the meaning, and yes, even the contemporary relevance of its laws and precepts, starts to jump out at you in unexpected and dramatic ways. This volume represents my attempt to give you a taste of the richness that the mysterious text patterns of Leviticus offer us. As you read, I hope that you too will be struck with some of the same wonder that I myself feel when coming across these links. And I hope that this wonder will excite not just your mind, but will touch your heart and soul as well. So that's his task as he lays it out before us. And some of the Parshiot have two essays, some have one. The essays are on the longer side as we think back through the different people we've learned and the length of their various passages. These run 11 to 20 pages. Each week I will choose one and we'll send you the entire thing, and we will be a continual exercise to figure out how to selectively read. Um, this one sort of skims a little more easily. So we're going to try to do some reading and some skimming and some skipping. Um, some of the others don't, and it will be my task to try to pick out the most salient parts. So that's what we're going to do together over the course of Vayikra. And we are going to begin with his first essay in Vayikra 1, called A Peek into the World of Offerings. Is there a matrix here? Of all the aspects of Judaism described by the Torah, perhaps none seems as alien to modern sensibilities as the notion of korbanot, especially animal offerings. For thousands of years now, the prayer has taken the place of these offerings as a prime way of serving the Almighty. And yet such offerings are ubiquitous in the book of Leviticus. Full chapters of the Torah are devoted to laws and regulations that describe and govern them. How should we in our day and age relate to these chapters? Should we merely gloss over them and move on, wait for the Messianic age when such offerings might emerge from dormancy in some shape or form, or what? By the way, I'll pause here just to note that I think it was last year that we did Rav Shai Held on Vayikra, and his take broadly was, if I recall correctly, sort of the world of Vayikra kind of reminds us, in a sense, of a utopia, sort of contained, self-sufficient micro world, and that it's helpful to, see that world, and sort of take a peek into that world from time to time. Here's, I think, a slightly different focus that we'll see. I'd like to suggest that these offerings remain instructive to us today. Even if they no longer define our practical actions, the spiritual themes that animate these offerings offer us some important truths. How might we see those themes? Okay, so his approach is going to be um, not metaphorical, not sort of like what is the symbolic significance of the offerings, but what is the underlying theme, emotion, um, quality of them that was true back then. And now, even if we don't offer the offerings, that those different characters of offerings still relate to the different ways of connecting to God that we have. How might we see those themes? Let's take a moment to briefly review. By the way, just you hear sort of his narrator voice. I think it's interesting. Some of these you really can imagine them as kind of spoken word. I think his voice um, has like a more spoken than written quality to it a lot of the time. Um, so it doesn't read as much like a written expository piece as much as a teacher's voice talking to you. Let's take a moment to briefly review the main types of offerings the Torah describes, and then we'll be better positioned to launch our exploration. The basic types of the Torah's animal offerings are introduced to us in the first 4 chapters of Parshat Vayikra. More or less, the text tells us of 3 categories, and there's some great footnotes where you can see the breadth and depth of his learning and knowledge, and where he sort of anticipates questions that a learned reader might raise. We're going to generally leave those aside, but they're worth delving into if you're interested. So more or less, the text tells us of 3 categories. These are the Olah, the Shlamim, and the Chatat. I was thinking about the fact that in the Piyut that we say before Musaf on Shalosh Regalim, we say V'la Toda, V'la Olah, V'la Mincha, V'la Chatat, V'la Asham, V'la Shlamim, V'la Miluim, Kol Korbanecha. We name 7 categories. Here we have only 3. So the Toda generally falls under the Shlamim. The Asham, he already brackets as a kind of a secondary, based on the model of the Chatat. The Mincha is a grain offering, so that's also bracketed here. We're talking about animal offerings, and the Miluim also a much more specialized kind of offering. So even when we look at the more expansive list of 7, we can sort of discard or subcategorize some of them so that we wind up with these 3 major categories. And again, they are the ones that occupy other than the Mincha, the opening chapters of Vayikra. So they're certainly the key ones. The Olah, the Shlamim, and the Chatat. How might we translate these terms? Some render an Olah as a burnt offering, but that's not a very literal translation of the term. This I thought was an interesting point, because I think if you stop me and ask me how to translate Olah, I would say entirely burnt offering. A more precise translation might be that which is offered up. Olah is an apt description for this particular offering, since by law it is to be entirely offered up to God, which is to say it is entirely consumed upon the altar. Quoting from the Pasuk, V'yiktira kohen takol hamizbecha Olah ishe reach nichoach laHashem. See how he does God's name here. Yud Kuf Vav Hey. Some do Yud Kuf Vav Kuf, Yud Daled Vav Daled. Just always interesting to see how people de-sanctify, so to speak, the names of God in printed materials. So he does Yud Kuf Vav Hey. So the priest shall offer it all upon the altar. It is an olah, an offering by fire of pleasing fragrance to God. I'm going to do a quick overview and then delve deeper. Our next category of offering, the shlamim, is often described as a peace offering or a wholeness offering, skipping a little, as opposed to the olah, which is entirely offered on the altar. The meat of a shlamim is meant to be shared, some eaten by the kohanim, the priests in the temple, some on the altar, and most consumed by the owners of the animal. The third type of animal offering is the chatat, the sin offering. many of whose laws are detailed in Leviticus chapter 4. This particular offering is brought by someone who inadvertently transgressed certain prohibitions in the Torah. Chatat offerings come in different varieties, but the salient feature is that some parts of its meat are offered upon the altar, but the rest is eaten exclusively by the Kohanim, not consumed by the owners at all. This is the very briefest of sketches. Other important distinctions exist between the three types of offerings too, but this will be enough to get us started. Having reviewed a bit about each offering, let's try to get some further context by considering an intriguing question. And it's, of course, the question that he's always asking. Do these various types of offerings first burst forth out of nowhere here in the book of Leviticus, or do they have earlier roots in the Torah too? And in this next paragraph, he just sort of offers a recapitulation of his overall thesis. We see where things come from or where they might be reflecting something earlier, we can understand their nature better. So let's ask, what episodes in the Torah, if any, might serve as the earliest historical touchstones for each offering? And here I would say, knowing his general style, there's going to be less extensive, connecting words and phrases, and it's a little bit more of a loose association in this essay. But we'll see some more dense mining of intertextually related stories in subsequent weeks. We'll start with the chatat, the sin offering. What is the earliest notion of sin or transgression that we find in the Torah? And by the way, why he organizes this way is interesting because chatat is the last of them in Vayikra that we're focusing on. And he started with Olah, but now he's starting with chatat. What's the earliest notion of sin or transgression that we find in the Torah? That question would seem to take us back to the earliest of all stories and land us squarely in the Garden of Eden. God had placed us in a veritable paradise and allowed us to eat of all of its wonderful trees save one. And we ignored the trees we could have eaten from, made a beeline, right? This is where you get to sort of his more colloquial terms. Made a beeline for the one tree that was off limits, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. In English, we have a synonym for the word sin, right? Chatat, which is transgression. Think about that word. Its very structure connotes a kind of violation of boundaries. The Hebrew equivalent, aveira, from the root, that should be ayin vav resh, that's just a mistake in the book, ayin vav resh, crossing over, suggests as much. What does boundary crossing have to do exactly with the idea of sin? Well, consider humanity's situation back in the garden, and here we're really more broadly thematic in terms of it's not so much the word connections as the conceptual connections. Consider humanity's situation back in the garden. By virtue of God's commands concerning those trees, there were now two domains in the world, one human and one divine. What was God's word? Mikol eitz hagan achol tochel. You can eat of every tree of the garden, but as for the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you must not eat of it. The human domain, as God describes it in that verse, contains virtually all the trees in the garden. Right here are all the wonderful trees. You should eat and enjoy all of them. But there's one tree on the other side of the boundary, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. It is as if God, the master of the garden, is saying, there is something about that tree that needs to remain mine. Everything else I give to you, but that's the tree in the garden which I reserve for myself. Then he goes on in the next paragraph to sort of say, that's what all sin or boundary crossing is. It's basically God saying some things are for you and some things are for me, not for you. And when you sin, you're crossing that boundary of things that are permitted to us into things that are forbidden to us. How does one atone for an illegitimate act of crossing boundaries? How does one make up for not showing the respect you should have shown? The answer would seem to be by showing the other that you regret having ignored the boundaries and are trying to make up for having done so. And it is through this lens, perhaps, that we can interpret the idea of the chatat. If humanity's first transgression involved an act of consuming something on the other side of that yellow tape, people ate things they weren't supposed to eat. A chatat creates an inverse of that. Humans give back something of their own to the divine, for God, as it were, to consume. This is brought home to the owner of the offering when that owner observes Kohanim quite literally eating the meat of an animal he or she previously owned. The tit for tat is right there for the owner to see. I consumed something of God's and benefited from it. Now people who represent God, Kohanim, are consuming something of mine and benefiting from it. In the footnote, he sort of points out that he's going to talk more that, maybe you would argue that that should be even better for an olah, because that really goes all to God. But that olah, he's going to make a different argument about. And actually, it's much more um, in your face, in a sense, when you see other people eating the thing as representatives of God than if it just gets all burnt up. So that's why specifically the chatat, which some of it is burnt, but some of it is specifically given to the Kohanim, as opposed to the Olah, which is entirely burnt, or the Shlamim, which you get to partake some of. That's why the Chatat is the best model. By offering to take something from my side of the boundary and using it to recompense God for any benefit illegitimately gained, I am signifying my desire to rectify matters. And it's interesting, I think the reading here, sort of two thoughts come to my mind. One is that you could imagine, when you do something wrong, the right way to show your regret is to say, I'm just going to try extra hard never to do that again, right? Almost the Rambam's tshuva model. When I'm faced with that thing, that challenge again, I won't do the wrong thing. But that maybe doesn't, there's no sacrifice involved in that, just a pledge for the future. And the sacrifice is a way of feeling it and showing it. And so I think there's something very much to that point. But in the same breath, he's putting it in a positive language, right? He's not sort of saying, therefore I am punished by losing something that belongs to me, but I am charged to give something of mine as a way of signifying my desire to rectify matters. So I think there's a sort of a positive spin on that. In the next footnote, in footnote 6, he sort of talks about, but the chatat is for inadvertent transgressions. Doesn't it really seem like this should be for intentional? Why are we really being punished for inadvertent? And he sort of argues, willful transgressions are so bad, a sacrifice isn't even enough. Inadvertent transgressions, you could say you didn't mean to, but you were still must have been lax or negligent in some way. And so this is the mode of rectification for that. The ideas we see expressed through the chatat, this is now the shlamim, of respect or non-violation of boundaries are important values to be upheld in humanity's relationship with God, the boundaries. But they are not the only important values. Indeed, another quality, one which balances out respect, is equally vital. And this seems to be where the shlamim comes in. Let's take a moment to examine the earliest references we have to shlamim offerings. The somewhat longer name Parshat Vayikra uses for a shlamim offering is a zevach shlamim. That's chapter 3. Again, chapter 1 is olah, 2 is mincha, 3 is shlamim, and 4 is chatat. So we are going in reverse order here. And we've bracketed the mincha since it's not an animal offering. And the first time we have an instance of this sort of offering actually being offered seems to be when the children of Israel sealed their covenant with God at Sinai with zivchei shlamim, reference not in Yitro, but in Parshat Mishpatim, the second account of the revelation at Sinai. If we go back even further in biblical history, for the first instance of an offering known as a zevach at all, we will find ourselves looking at another sealing of a covenant, this time between Jacob and his father-in-law Lavan. Something about this kind of offering seems connected to the making of a covenant. Why would the sealing of covenants be associated with this particular type of offering? The name of the offering might provide us a clue. The word shlamim, as I mentioned before, is a version of the word shalem, which means peace or wholeness. There is indeed a kind of wholeness that comes about through a covenant. A covenant both creates and defines a new relationship between two parties. Before a covenant, there was just me and you, two entirely separate beings. But after a covenant is struck between us, there really are three parties, you, me, and us. A new we has been created in the bond struck between us. A new wholeness has come into the world. There are, of course, different kinds of we's. Some covenants establish trade agreements or business corporations, etc. But the more profound levels, like those struck in love, the kind of we they create is a new family. Whenever a new we gets made, certainly when the we is loving and sublime, but even when it is more superficial and transactional, we intuit that there is cause for celebration. When Yaakov and Lavan sealed their covenant at Gal-Eid, even though they didn't quite part on the best of terms, still their families feasted together to mark the occasion. And at the more sublime end of things, Israel feasted at Sinai when their covenant with God was created. When we make covenants, we sit down and feast. We celebrate the new wholeness that is being brought into the world. We might then say that a shlamim offering, the offering whose very name denotes celebration of wholeness, evokes a different energy than respect. It is an offering that interestingly still has something to do with a crossing of boundaries, but not in a transgressive way, rather in a good way. A shlamim perhaps evokes sharing, a value that is at the core of all covenants. Fittingly, sharing governs how the shlamim is supposed to be consumed. Part is eaten by the owners of the offering, and part is given to God on the altar. So to put this in terms of the model of domains we introduced earlier, if people have their domain and God has God's domain, a shlami might be a way of saying, could we share? Maybe I could have a part and you'll have a part, and we will go forward together. So that's the shlamim. And again, thinking about his kind of framework of boundaries, the chatat is the response to transgressing a boundary by taking something from your side and handing it off, giving it up to the other side. The shlamim is a mutual crossing of boundaries to create a new shared entity, and therefore it's sort of the feasting and the owners partaking is symbolic of that. The Olah, from Noach to Abraham. And you can see again, because it's a big picture, we're not delving as much into the nuances of text, but still seeing those connections to the precursors to these offerings. On to the third category, the Olah. The very first recorded Olah was brought by Noah, immediately upon his exit from the ark. The next recorded Olah in the Torah was the offering Abraham readied himself to give in the story we know as the binding of Isaac, or the Akedah. God said, take your son, your special one, the one whom you love, Yitzchak, and go to the land of Moriah, v'ha'alehu sham le'olah, offer him there as an olah on one of the mountains, which I will point out to you. Interesting translation. What commonality, if any, exists in Noach and Abraham's offerings? I would suggest it is the notion of awe. Consider Noach and his particular unique vantage point on life at the moment he brought the olah. He and his family had just survived the flood. Upon leaving the ark, Noach gazed at a new world. In one sense, it was a world that was his for the taking. God had blessed him and told him to be fruitful and multiply, asking him to fill the earth with his progeny. But in another sense, was it really his at all? Noach witnessed God acting as the master of creation, deigning to destroy God's handiwork entirely and to start fresh with a new world. The notion that mankind owns this world in any ultimate sense would seem laughable to Noach in the aftermath of the flood. Noach, more than anyone else in history, must have been acutely conscious that the earth can never really be possessed by a human. It's a realization that on some level, not only Noach can intuit, but we can too. All of us in our quieter moments can look upon at the earth upon which we tread, and realize that it outlasts us. We don't really own earth. If anything, at the end of our lives, the earth takes us back, and it is it that owns us. Again, these just little beautiful insights we just get along the way here. This sensibility is what we mean by awe. Or to put it in the language of domains we spoke about earlier, an olah is neither about transgressing domains nor about sharing them. It is about a renunciation of the idea that I really have a domain at all. That is, an olah says, in truth, there is no my domain and your domain, God. It is all your domain. In recognition of this, Noach punctuated his entry into the new world with an olah, an offering given entirely to God. The next recorded olah, that of Abraham, evoked a similar stance, for in the Akedah, God asked Abraham for the one thing in life that we might instinctively say is most surely his, meaning Abraham's, his child, Yitzchak. If anything is mine, it must be that. And yet in the Akedah, it is precisely this that Abraham is asked to give back to God. In complying with God's request for this olah, Abraham was really saying, even that which seems most mine in this world, I cannot in good conscience withhold from the master of the universe. God can lay claim over all that seems to be mine. Now, again, we always know that the Akedah has heavy moral overtones. And I think something that's interesting about, while he's not delving into it, about the framework that Rabbi Foreman is providing here is I think we often think the moral weight of the Akedah is the idea that someone is asked to kill their child, the unthinkable. And he's tweaking it a little bit by moving away from that and focusing on, maybe it's euphemistic, but not on killing one's child, which it still entails, but on giving back one's child. So it's through that framework that we sort of sidestep a little bit the heaviest moral weight of the Akedah, and sort of shift to, well, it's a reminder about who does anything belong to anyway. God can lay claim over all that seems to be mine. And footnote goes into it a little bit more. In summary, we're doing great on time here. In summary, and this is again one of the things I think is characteristic of Rabbi Foreman, because he's such I think, a brilliant teacher. Not that much explanation is necessary. As we go through, he unpacks it for us. So maybe that'll enable us to cover a little bit more. In summary, if the Shlamim is about sharing, the Olah is about surrender. Surrender and sharing are in some ways the same. They both entail a merging of domains, but they work in very different, almost opposite ways. One of the things I think also is powerful about this is just the immediate application to the ways we think about interpersonal human relationships. Transgressing boundaries vis-a-vis other people, creating a partnership with other people, and surrendering something to another. When I share, I give to you and you give to me. I have to have a space that's mine. You have to have a space that's yours. And then we can each give something we share. Awe is something else entirely. It is the surrender of my domain to yours. It is a recognition that there is and always has been one domain only, yours. Now, just again, a comment on the side. I think this relates to something I always struggle with in Hasidic teaching, that sort of the negation of the self is a form of the ultimate service of God. In a way, he really is saying that. But it never is totally true. We still have to preserve a sense of ourselves in order to express awe. Awe is still our own. Even to surrender something to God, you have to have yourself that you're surrendering in some paradoxical way. So it's a little bit slippery here, but just noting that. To put this in terms of relationships, we might say that sharing, or the love that arises from it, is in some ways similar to awe. Both evince the quality of adoration, and nowadays, if we aren't careful, we can slip into using the two words almost interchangeably, right? I'm in awe of you, or I love you. And yet awe is in truth a very different quality from love. Love, characterized by giving, is a relationship of equals. I give to you, you give to me. And so we meet in love on a level playing field. Love, at least of the romantic variety, implies a certain prizing of the individuality of the other. I must be I, with a real sense of separateness and independence, in order for me to be able to give to you, or for me to be able to receive from you. If we each have that independence, then we can share. When it comes to awe, though, all this changes. I don't see myself as your equal, separate and independent. If I am truly in awe of you, I see you as completely above and beyond me. Independence is the last thing on my mind. Awe compels me to abandon my sense of separateness in the face of your overwhelming presence. It's not necessarily a total negation of the self, but it's certainly a minimizing of the self in light of the overwhelming presence of the awesome other. The Torah presents the Akedah as an episode in which Abraham is said to have demonstrated awe of the Almighty. At the climax of the Akedah, an angel addresses Abraham and tells him, Atayadati ki yirei Elokim ata. Now I know that you are in awe of God. But the careful reader will note that this is not the first time the text of the Akedah uses that particular word. In the footnote, he recognizes that there are variations in the shoresh here, but the letter string is consistent. It has appeared earlier, albeit in a different form. Interestingly, one of the three-letter combinations that appears over and over again in the story of the binding of Isaac is Yud Resh Aleph. Earlier in the story, though, this combination of letters meant something else. It invariably meant to see. By way of example, on the third day, Abraham lifted up his eyes, Vayar, there's the Yud Resh Aleph, and saw the place from afar. But at the end of the Akedah, the same combination of letters suddenly means to be in awe of, as in the verse we saw above. The Torah thereby seems to be signaling a connection of sorts between the experience of being in awe on the one hand and seeing on the other. What is the nature of this connection? Well, think for a moment of something that might leave you awestruck, and now consider how sight might affect that experience. Let's say you see that something from up close. Would you say that you are more likely to feel awestruck by it or less likely? The answer probably is it depends. Some things leave me with a sense of awe on account of deception or illusion, like a magic trick, for example. I may find myself staring with mouth agape at a magician who pulls the card I've picked out of an unsliced orange. The card I've picked out of an unsliced orange. But the magician will never perform the trick twice. He or she will never do the trick for me in slow motion, because if I observe it too closely, I won't be in awe of it anymore. We can rightfully then call this fake awe. The awe is illusory, for the closer I see the thing, the more diminished my sense of wonder. With true awe, however, the reverse is true. The closer I see the thing, the more profound my sense of wonder. By the way, I think this is really is true about relationships and people also. There are some, maybe they're celebrities sometimes that, we're in awe of them from afar, but the more you study them, the less impressive they become. I think the real heroes in this world are the people that the better you get to know them, the more you are impressed with them. I continually use that description to talk about Ravavi, someone who I feel the incredible honor of getting to know him closer and see him in more dimensions of his life, the more amazed I am by him. Consider a human cell. View it under your average high school grade microscope, and it looks like no big deal. There's a little dot for a nucleus, some cytoplasm around it, and a little round cell membrane to hold it all together. But now look at it under an electron microscope, where each atom is the size of a tennis ball, where the cell as a whole seems to extend for miles, and where the manufacturing capacity of the system dwarfs that of New York City. And suddenly a sense of boundless wonder emerges. With true awe, the closer you look, the more speechless you become. And so it is with God, the master of the universe. For the most part in this world of ours, God remains safely out of sight. Indeed, the Almighty is invisible to the human eye. A good thing, too, because the Torah tells us that a human being cannot truly see the presence of God and survive the experience. But this invisibility also fosters certain illusions. We can, if we are not careful, overplay our hand in the world. We humans dominate other forms of life and are stewards of this planet, but we can easily succumb to the hubristic notion that we have ultimate power, that our I is entirely self-sufficient. That is a fiction made possible by God's being so difficult for us to perceive. Other fictions are more subtle, like the notion that we can meet God on level ground, as it were, as if we were two co-equal independent beings. Yes, we, like God, are beings possessed of free will, and hence a certain kind of equality exists between us and the master of the universe. Enough equality, perhaps, that the notion of our having a relationship with God characterized by love and mutual giving is not completely laughable. But the closer one comes to actually encountering God, the closer our brush with transcendence, the less our sense of independence becomes possible to maintain. It is for that reason, maybe, that Yirat Hashem is perhaps a double entendre. The phrase can be read as awe of the Almighty, on the one hand, that is its plain sense, and seeing God on the other. That's a little bit more of a homiletical read of the term. To encounter God as if one could see him right there before you is to feel dumbstruck with awe. It is to feel a sense that my eye is fragile. My eye is fragile and as nothing in the face of your, capital Y, everything, capital E. And that is the energy of the Olah. The notion of boundaries, of my having my own domain is an illusion, a matrix. Looking back then on these three offerings, the Chatat, the Shlamim, and the Olah, we can see them perhaps as emblems of three stances we might carve out in our relationship with God. Moreover, we might say that these stances build on each other. The starting point, the most basic stance in my relationship with God, is that of respect. Most basically, I am called upon to stay in my lane. Enjoy your domain, partake in the world, but don't transgress God's domain. Have some respect. Honor that which God places off limits for us human beings, God's guests in the universe. And if you do transgress, the notion of respect calls upon you to recognize that and seek to rectify things. The emblem of this is the chatat. Once I master respect, and of course, the fact that now we understand why he laid them out in the order that he did, because he's going to explain the stances as developing from chatat to shlamim to olah, which of course then still raises the question why the Torah presents them in the opposite order for this explanation. The emblem of this is the Chatan. Once I master respect, another possibility opens up for me. I can participate in a covenant with God. I can be in a we with God. I can give to God, and hopefully God can give back to me. I can seek wholeness and love with God. The emblem of this is the Shlamim. And then another possibility begins to open up. The visceral, rarefied truth of the Olah. Occasionally, for all of God's invisibility, I feel as if I can glimpse God's presence. I can feel awe with respect to God. In moments of awe, I see my own separateness as illusory. The notion that I have anything at all I can call my own is laughable. In moments like these, I surrender entirely to the divine. It is here that a human being feels compelled to offer an olah. By the way, as I'm reading, one thought comes to mind about the ordering as it appears in the Torah, which is Rabbi Foreman has presented the order in reverse as a way of talking about the human being's quest for relationship with God. Maybe we could suggest, just a thought, that the way it's presented in the Torah comes more from kind of the truest truths about God as God, which is the starting point is the Olah. It's God's all-encompassing, limitless presence. That's from God's perspective, the truest truth. Then comes Shlamim, because sort of the second dimension or second order idea about God is the God who seeks relationship, covenant, and partnership. And that actually, really, from God's perspective, so to speak, if you could say such a thing, the notion of the preservation of boundaries in relationship with the human being may actually kind of be only a, so to speak, a tertiary truth about God. Just a thought about the respective orderings. I'd like to close with a word about love and awe. It seems to me that although both are desirable, there is an inherent tension, almost a paradox, between the ideals of love of God and awe of God. Certainly much rabbinic and Hasidic and other texts spend time talking about this relationship, the Rambam too, between Ahavat Hashem and Yirat Hashem, love of God and awe of God. One might perhaps envision the two as if they were a kind of alternating current in electricity. A human being in relationship with God needs to somehow alternate between love and awe, seesawing between them. Of the two stances, love is the more ubiquitous one. For the bulk of our time here on earth, we see ourselves as individuals, possessed of free will. Hence, we see ourselves as cultivating a bond of affection with the divine, and as giving to and receiving from God in the context of that bond. But every once in a while, a deeper recognition pierces us, and we become taken with a sense of awe. Indeed, moments of awe toward the divine are generally less common than moments of love. The sense of surrender and loss of self-adherence in awe, if maintained, if maintained over the long term, might well imperil the sense of individuality that is necessary to assert oneself and achieve things in our day-to-day world. Thus, at some point, we retreat from being overtaken with awe and move back toward the stance of sharing and love, only to veer into awe again when we find ourselves so moved. The catalyst may be a sense of personal crisis or difficulty, or nothing more out of the ordinary than a particularly reflective walk in the woods. But in those moments, the bottom falls out of our sense of independence and strength, and our stance toward God veers into awe and surrender. It is natural for a human to shuttle between the two in their relationship with God. Respect, love, and awe, three stances, three offerings. We may not have these three offerings anymore, but we do experience the stances they represent. All of us do. Together, they form a matrix of possibilities that we each seek to navigate as we develop our own personal relationships with the Master of the universe. So I always find his voice to have a certain kind of quiet but very strong confidence just like I'm presenting to you a relatively comprehensive picture of the Torah, the world as I see it. And, I always find myself sort of saying, what is there a counter argument here? What else, what other ways might there to be to look at this? But I find myself taken in by the compelling presentation content and style wise. Um, and obviously there's much more to delve into in the details of the offerings and sort of see if we can map more of these concepts on. But as a framework, and again, remembering how he did it through looking at the antecedents of each one in Breshit and Shmot, again, not with rigorous literary parallels, but more thematic, broad parallels. These ideas come to light. So happy to hear questions, comments, reactions as we start our Rabbi David Foreman journey. Yeah, Lance, please.
Rav Stephen, who owns your children?
It's a great question. It's not me.
Not
Um,
you. Who is it then?
I don't know why I'm hesitating to say God. Um,
What is a pidyon haben?
right? There is that notion of redemption of the firstborn that certainly highlights the idea that everything we have belongs to God, including our children, and
Nope.
therefore they need to be redeemed.
Nope.
Yep.
Your children belong to me.
Oh, because you're the Kohen.
Right. And my children belong to me. Who belongs to the first Aliyah every time the Torah is read?
The right goes to the Kohen.
Kohen, right? That's right. Unfortunately, as I read these analyses, I find in the book of Leviticus seems to be that the Kohanim are almost forgotten, right? Where is the discussion of the Kohanim here? Few references here and there. Okay. The main point here is, I think, that the Kohanim represent the community and the rabbi represents the individual. And that means that the Kohanim are Jewish and the rabbis are Christian. And that means that the Samaritans are true Jews and the rabbis are fake Jews.
Okay.
So tell me I'm wrong. Prove to me I'm wrong. I would love to be wrong.
I don't have any initial response, just
Okay.
letting it settle.
Uh,
Rabbi Scott.
I want to.
Oh, Moshe. Sorry, go ahead. And then we're going to go to Rabbi Scott and then Bracha. Go ahead, Moshe.
All right. Number one, after the destruction of the temple, we became rabbinic Jews. That's number one. That Kohanim could say lost their power. Suppose I read there were some of them were very arrogant. They would take a fork and just take, the meat off the base of Magdash. So therefore, the Kohanim, for all intents purpose, got their due thing. They lost their somewhat prestige to a certain extent, you could say. That it was more the rabbis that say, okay, this is the law. They argue back and forth, blah blah blah. But eventually, throughout the history, up until from the Mishnah, the Talmud, the Tosfos, the Rashi, and then finally to the Shulchan Aruch, and the Rambam, everything was more or less codified, fine tuned all the laws. And also, I also want to bring in another point that just occurred to me. I always thought that when a pasha begins with the word vav, it's supposed to be connected to the other pasha. Can't you say that about Vayikra? That's connected to at least to the last two
Yes.
pashas of Shemos.
Yes.
Like in Shemos, first you have to, before you get married, you make sure you have a job and you make sure you have a place. You don't get married and do it the other way. Here they said, okay, let's have a Mishkan, let's have a tent, let's have et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All right, now let's talk about sacrifices to bring.
Yes. All great points. I think I'm sure Lance has some rejoinders he might like to offer about the state of the Kohanim vis-a-vis the rabbis, but I think I appreciate the way you kind of laid out, even just descriptively, the history and the shift in roles. Um, and yes, I think the it's important to note and easy to forget that Vayikra, even though it's an entirely new book and there's a few lines of blank space in the Torah, picks up only moments, it seems, after the end of Shemot, when the cloud descends on the tabernacle and Moshe can't enter. And then God calls out to Moshe from the tent of meeting, and the book begins. So I don't think Rabbi Foreman was attempting to suggest that, you know, that without his demonstrating it, there is no connection between Breshit and Shemot on the one hand and Vayikra on the other, just that for the reader, it suddenly feels like a whole other domain, and that we've switched from narrative to law. But you're right that it absolutely is an overstatement on his part, because the already when we get focused in on the construction of the Mishkan, that's much less narrative than the previous sections. And here are the laws that pertain to what should happen inside the Mishkan that was just constructed. So I think you're right that, he formulates it a little bit extreme. There are obvious continuities even in the plain sense, but still the shift to the laws of sacrifices is a little jarring. And you would look at it and say, certainly, what does this have to do with the stories in Breshit, for example? And he's arguing for that continuity.
And
So, Scott?
can I say
Oh,
something?
yeah, one more word, Moshe, please.
One more thing about the Akeda, about the body. You said it's like an Ola. Can't you say metaphorically in Israel, when a father takes his son, to meet at the meeting point to go to the Sakal Haganah? Can't you say that's like a form of binding metaphorically?
Mm,
Of
yeah,
giving. That's when
um,
give up totally.
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, it certainly does feel. I mean, to unpack the parallels and differences in my mind to the Binding of Isaac, there's a lot there, but it certainly does feel like an expression of willingness to give one's life for something beyond oneself. Um, and by the way, certainly relevant to that is the question of what was the age of Yitzchak at the Binding of Isaac, right? We have the stories that say that he was younger, the stories that say that he was older. How you read that, will strengthen or vary how similar it is to that moment of sending our children off to the army. So, but I think there's certainly something to think about what are the contemporary parallels, no doubt. Rav Scott, please. You're muted still.
It seems to me that the arguments regarding the role of the Kohen within the community are compensated for here a little bit by the acknowledgement of the rabbis that this third book of the Torah is Torah Kohanim,
Mm.
and a certain amount of respect and deference is indicated not just by the title of the text, but by all of the things that Lance is pointing out that the Kohen gets to do. Even though it seems to me that the primary function of the Kohen was to serve as a cultic leader, and and in all of the arguments about the position of the Kohen in the community, I think it is imperative for us to recall that there's a reason that the Kohanim are displaced by the rabbis. And there are plenty of arguments about it, but there's a small section in Menachot where it talks about bringing sacrifices, and where Shmuel Bar Nachmani says that when the prophet Malachi says that sacrifices could be offered outside the temple, Shmuel Bar Nachmani responds, these are Torah scholars who engage in Torah study in every place they live. God says, I ascribe to them credit as though they burn and present sacrifices in my name. And I don't know about anybody else here. I'm not looking forward to the time when sacrifices are reinstated. That might be particularly because I'm a Levi and I'm not interested in doing all the cleanup. But I really think that the focus on Kohanim is a little bit exaggerated, and that the rabbis have good reason or had good reason to um, take their place as community leaders, but also I think it's for us to remember that or consider that if the sacrificial cult remained in place, Judaism would probably go the route of every other ancient religion that offered sacrifices. And that the rabbis did a great service to the Jewish community by replacing the role of the Kohen with the role of the rabbi.
Fascinating thoughts, and I appreciate what you sort of described, that even in supplanting, right, there's a dimension of the Kohanim's honor which is preserved, and we're trying, whenever there are seismic shifts in community structures, you have to think about what happens to those who are being displaced, and how does that, how are they still honored and included. So I think it's really interesting. I don't think, trying to think through the essays that we picked out, I don't think there's much that focuses in the ones we're looking at in Vayikra on kind of the role of the Kohanim, but there's certainly a lot that could be developed there. Even thinking about his kind of model, and who are the Kohanim in earlier books, non-Jewish Kohanim, Yitro, Malki Tzedek, and kind of what's the proto model of the Kohen. There's a lot. Yeah, I don't know if we're getting some lively lightning through our windows here.
May I respond?
Hang on a moment, because I know Bracha was waiting, so I'm going to come to her, and but I promise you'll get a chance to comment back before we wrap up.
Thank you.
Bracha, please.
Yeah, it's just a quick thing, and it's a side thought. Where going back to the Akedah, where Abraham is told to take his one and only son that he loves. Why does it say love in past tense? It says Asher Havta.
Yes, you probably know by now that my biblical Hebrew grammar is a little bit rusty, but I think it means something more like you have always loved. There's in fact, almost to turn your question on its head, if it were Ohev, it might read like that you love now and only now, that you're currently loving. I think Ahavta is something like I'm not saying the right words, but it's like a past continuous, like that you have always been loving up to and including now. I think that's what's meant by it. I'd be curious that, if commentaries pick up on some way about, with a different reading along the lines of what you're suggesting, because certainly in modern Hebrew, we relate to that as more of like a past, a perfect, or whatever that term is for something, a completed action of the past. But I think here it's meant to be understood as a past continuous with the present. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. All right, I'm just going to take a quick skim before we circle back to Lance, so I know we'll want to say more on the Kohanim if anyone wants to comment on these three offerings and their three stances, or just on first reactions to Rabbi Foreman and his style. Yep, Joan?
Well, by the way, I saw Rabbi Foreman once on JBS and he was so brilliant. I'm so glad you brought him up again because I always would love to study with him. But to me, I always, look for the human element here and not that you don't, but I'm just saying that to me, these give you three very interesting ways to relate to God, as you actually put it, and also to relate to people. So I think it's quite fascinating.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, he does. Again, I sometimes think maybe I'm sure it's more complex than the way he's laying it out, but even in the shorthand, it's so compelling and rich, and in many ways I find, characteristic of his teachings in the way they're sort of clear and tight. It makes them easier to remember, and sometimes it's helpful to have these sort of clear basic rubrics for Torah concepts that make them memorable, and like you said, that make them applicable to our everyday. Yeah. Okay, back to Lance.
Okay, number one, what is the one Jewish ritual that no Levi can ever see?
I like these trivia questions.
See?
Birkas Kahanim?
Nope.
What is it?
Nope. Okay. 2 weeks ago, I was in Mini. We had 10 men, and I was the only Kohen there. So I went up and I got the Kohen Aliyah. And guess what? There was no Levi. Who gets the Levi Aliyah?
The Kohen.
Thank you. Number
That's
two.
because you're a Levi.
Well, that's a good point. The other thing is that the Levium were musicians. And I think, forgetting about the cleaning up and that sort of thing, the Son of Commandos did that. The Levium were musicians and glorious musicians. Anyway, what is
Later.
the mitzvah of Vikidashto?
That's it's interpreted as the mitzvah to give the Kohen pride of place in their various rituals and leading things and other opportunities.
Right. Okay. Now, if I do not accept the oral law, am I still a Jew?
I would say yes.
So that means that a Karaite is a Jew, that a Nigerian Jewish Igbo is a Jew, that a Messianic Christian is a Jew, that a Samaritan is a Jew, right? None of those except the oral law. All I would consider them, obviously, I would consider them all Jewish. Now, finally, who in the world makes the Paschal lamb sacrifice coming up at the beginning of Pesach? Rabbis? Is there a rabbi in the world who does that?
The Samaritans.
The Samaritans do it. And the Samaritan religion is run entirely by the Kohen Gadol. And there are Samaritans named Cohen. Thank you and good night.
Mic drop. Great, great, great. All right, we are underway with Rabbi Foreman and with all of you. Great to have a nice group here. And we should be continuing. I'm always just double checking my calendar and then usually not even remembering even after I double check it, but should be on for next Monday night with Parshat Sav, and look forward to seeing everyone. So glad you're
All
here.
right. We won't be in synagogue because we're going to a wedding on Sunday, so it's going to be rough.
Okay, we'll miss you, but great to learn together. Love to mom and dad, and good week to all.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
All right.